Panic set in as red and blue lights flashed behind the family's SUV, terrifying the two little kids in the back seat. An arrogant rogue cop thought he had found an easy target, slapping handcuffs on a defenseless father in broad daylight. But this corrupt officer made one fatal mistake. He had absolutely no idea who he just pulled over. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in the quiet, affluent suburb of Oak Creek, Illinois. David Miller, a 38-year-old architectural engineer and owner of a highly successful local construction firm, was driving his silver Chevrolet Suburban down Elm Street. In the back seat were the centers of his universe, his 9-year-old son Leo and his 6-year-old daughter Chloe. They were completely engrossed in a debate over which ice cream parlor had the best chocolate sprinkles, blissfully unaware of the nightmare creeping up behind them. David was a man who built things from the ground up. He was respected in the community, known for his calm demeanor, his sharp intellect, and his unwavering dedication to his family. But for the past 3 months, David's life had been shadowed by a localized, deeply ingrained system of extortion. Enter Officer Thomas Higgins. Higgins was a 15-year veteran of the Oak Creek Police Department. To the casual observer, he was a stern enforcer of the law. But to local business owners, particularly minority contractors and small-scale developers, Higgins was a tyrant. He ran a sophisticated, off-the-books protection racket. If you were building in Higgins' district, you paid a monthly security and fast-track fee in cash. If you didn't, your job sites were suddenly plagued by anonymous vandalism. Your workers were endlessly harassed with parking tickets, and your delivery trucks were pulled over for agonizing, hours-long commercial vehicle inspections. David Miller had flatly refused to pay. When Higgins approached David at a diner 2 weeks prior, sliding a piece of paper with a cash amount across the table, David had looked him dead in the eye and said no. Higgins had smiled a cold, dead smile, promising David he would deeply regret his arrogance. Now, as David glanced in his rearview mirror, his stomach tightened. The black and white cruiser of the Oak Creek PD was riding his bumper. The license plate scanner on the cruiser had pinged, and David knew exactly who was behind the wheel. "Daddy, why is that police car so close?" Leo asked, his voice losing its playful tone, replaced by a sudden, sharp anxiety. "It's okay, buddy," David said, keeping his voice perfectly level. "He's just driving. Everything is fine." But it wasn't fine. Without warning, the cruiser's sirens blared, a deafening, aggressive wail that made little Chloe shriek and cover her ears. The flashing lights bounced off the interior of the Suburban. David immediately hit his blinker and pulled over into the parking lot of an abandoned strip mall, ensuring they were in a wide, open space. He shifted the car into park, turned off the engine, and rolled down all 4 windows. "Listen to me, guys," David said, turning around to look his children in the eyes. "Daddy is going to talk to the police officer. I need you both to stay in your seats, keep your seat belts on, and just stay quiet. Do you understand? I promise you nothing bad is going to happen." He sounded confident, but beneath his polo shirt, a tiny microphone was taped to his sternum. David hadn't just ignored Higgins' threats, he had gone straight to the federal government. For the last 10 days, David had been working as a cooperating witness for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 blocks away, hidden behind the tinted windows of an unassuming utility van, FBI Special Agent Richard Dawson and a team of 4 heavily armed federal agents were listening to every single breath David took. "Target has initiated a traffic stop," Dawson said into his radio, adjusting his headset. "Alpha Team, hold your perimeter. We need Higgins to explicitly state the extortion demand on tape before we move. Miller, if things go sideways, use the abort phrase. We are 60 seconds out." David couldn't respond to the wire, but he took a deep breath. He watched in the side mirror as Officer Higgins stepped out of the cruiser. Higgins was a large, imposing man, adjusting his utility belt as he sauntered toward the Suburban with a swagger built on years of unchecked power. He didn't approach immediately. He took his time walking around the back of the SUV, trailing his hand along the taillight, a classic intimidation tactic. When Higgins finally appeared at the driver's side window, he didn't ask for a license. He leaned in close, resting his forearms on the doorframe, invading David's personal space. Well, Higgins sneered, his eyes darting to the frightened kids in the back before locking back onto David. If it isn't the stubborn contractor, you have a taillight out, Miller, and you failed to signal the lane change 3 blocks back. You're driving recklessly with children in the car. My taillights are perfectly fine, officer, David replied calmly, his hands resting clearly at the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel. And I signaled my turn. Are you calling me a liar, boy? Higgins' voice dropped an octave, dripping with malice. Because out here my word is the law. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Now. David slowly reached into the glove compartment, narrating his movements to keep the situation de-escalated. I am reaching for my registration, officer. As David handed the papers over, Higgins snatched them, barely looking at them. You know, Miller, your construction site on 4th Avenue had a little accident last night. Someone smashed a skid steer into a load of imported lumber. Tragic. Could have been prevented if you had proper security. In the FBI van, Agent Dawson leaned forward. Say the number, Higgins. Say the damn number. But Higgins was playing with his food. He looked at the kids again. You're setting a bad example for your kids, Miller. Breaking the law, disrespecting authority. Step out of the vehicle. Officer, I haven't done anything to warrant stepping out of my vehicle, David said, maintaining his composure. My children are in the car, and they are frightened. Just write the citation if you believe I committed an infraction. I said, step out of the damn car. Higgins roared, his hand dropping to the grip of his taser. Chloe began to cry, a high-pitched, terrified sound. Leo reached over and grabbed his sister's hand, his own eyes wide with panic. Okay, David said smoothly. I am stepping out. Please, do not scare my children. David unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The moment his feet touched the pavement, the trap was set, and the countdown to Higgins's downfall began. The afternoon heat was oppressive, but the chill radiating from Officer Higgins was ice cold. As soon as David was fully out of the SUV, Higgins grabbed him roughly by the shoulder and spun him around, slamming him chest first against the hot metal of the Suburban's side door. Hey! Leo screamed from the back seat, unbuckling his seatbelt. Leave my dad alone. Leo, stay in the car. David commanded sharply, turning his head as far as Higgins' grip would allow. Do not get out. Look at me, I am fine. Higgins shoved David harder against the car. Shut your mouth, Miller. You don't give orders here. Higgins unclipped his handcuffs. The sound of the metal ratcheting echoed loudly in the quiet parking lot. He grabbed David's left wrist, twisting it painfully behind his back, and clamped the steel cuff down hard, deliberately kicking it 2 notches tighter than necessary, so it bit directly into David's bone. He aggressively wrenched David's right arm back to meet it, securing the cuffs. You're making a massive mistake, Officer Higgins, David said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the searing pain in his wrists. He knew every word was being transmitted to the unmarked van sitting just out of sight. The only mistake made was you thinking you could play in my town without paying the toll, Higgins whispered maliciously, leaning in so close that David could smell the stale coffee and peppermint gum on his breath. You think you're untouchable because you wear a nice watch and drive a nice car. I own these streets. I can pull you over every single day. I can plant a bag of narcotics under your driver's seat right now and have you locked up for a decade." Inside the surveillance van, the audio fed clearly through the speakers. Agent Dawson's eyes narrowed. "He's threatening to plant evidence," Dawson noted to the recording technician beside him. "We have the extortion, we have civil rights violations under color of law, and we have threat of fabricating evidence. He's digging his own grave. Do we move in, boss?" asked Agent Miller, gripping his tactical rifle. "Hold," Dawson ordered. "Let him keep talking. The more he incriminates himself on tape, the tighter the federal indictment." Back in the parking lot, Higgins began roughly patting David down. He found David's wallet and tossed it onto the hood of the cruiser. Then his hands patted over David's chest. For a terrifying split second, David felt Higgins' knuckles brush against the small, hard plastic of the wire transmitter taped beneath his shirt. David held his breath. If Higgins found the wire, the situation would escalate from a corrupt shakedown to a potentially lethal confrontation in front of his children. But Higgins was too arrogant to do a thorough search. He was too focused on the power trip. He grabbed David by the collar and dragged him backward, away from the SUV and toward the police cruiser. Chloe was sobbing hysterically now, her face pressed against the glass of the back window. Leo was hitting the inside of the door, screaming for the officer to stop. The sight of his children in such deep distress tore at David's heart, but he knew he had to let the scene play out. He was taking this pain today so no other innocent person in Oak Creek would ever have to suffer under Higgins again. "Look at them crying," Higgins taunted, forcing David down onto the curb beside the cruiser's rear tire. "This is what happens when you don't cooperate. You think this is bad? Wait until I call Child Protective Services. I'll tell them I found drug paraphernalia in the car. They'll take your kids away tonight, Miller. They'll be in the foster system before the sun goes down." David's jaw tightened. Higgins had just crossed a line that no man should ever cross. Threatening a man's business was one thing. Weaponizing his children was unforgivable. "You want this to go away." Higgins continued, kneeling down so he was eye to level with David. "You bring $50,000 in cash to the marina parking lot tomorrow at midnight. 50 grand pays for the back taxes you owe me, and it ensures your kids sleep in their own beds tomorrow night. Do we have an understanding, or do I call CPS right now?" David looked at the corrupt officer. He didn't see a man of the law. He saw a pathetic thug hiding behind a badge. $50,000, David repeated clearly, ensuring the microphone picked up every syllable. "You are asking me for $50,000 in cash to not plant drugs in my car and to not call CPS. I'm not asking you for anything," Higgins sneered, standing back up and resting his hand on his weapon. "I'm telling you, and if you even think about going to the mayor or the captain, you're a dead man. I run this precinct." In the van, Agent Dawson stood up. "We have the explicit dollar amount. We have the threat of violence. We have the threat against his family. It's a wrap." Dawson keyed his radio. "Alpha Team, execute. Go, go, go. Box him in." David looked up at Higgins, who was currently strutting back toward his cruiser to grab his ticket book, likely to write a fake citation to justify the stop. "It's a shame," David said loudly, his voice echoing across the blacktop. "It's a shame the weather is turning bad." It was the abort phrase, the signal that David had had enough and that his children needed to be secured immediately. Higgins paused, looking over his shoulder with a confused frown. "The weather, there isn't a cloud in the sky, you idiot." Before Higgins could turn back around, the piercing sound of screeching tires shattered the afternoon air. From the north entrance of the parking lot, two black, unmarked SUVs came roaring in, moving at terrifying speed. From the south entrance, the utility van drifted around the corner, its tires smoking as it slammed to a halt directly behind Higgins' police cruiser, completely blocking him in. Higgins jumped back, instinctively drawing his service weapon, his eyes darting frantically between the three vehicles that had just ambushed him. "Oak Creek Police, drop your weapons," he screamed, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. The doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. Men and women wearing tactical gear, heavy body armor, and olive-drab ballistic helmets poured out. Emblazoned across their chests and backs in bold, unmissable yellow letters was a single acronym: FBI. FBI, drop the W Fiaben. DRPD now. Agent Dawson stepped out from the passenger side of the lead SUV, his federal badge raised high in one hand, his sidearm leveled perfectly at Higgins' chest in the other. Higgins froze. His gun was drawn, but he was staring down the barrels of 6 federal assault rifles. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His hands began to shake violently. "Thomas Higgins," Dawson's voice boomed, cutting through the heavy silence that had suddenly fallen over the lot. "Lower your weapon, place it on the ground, and lace your hands behind your head. If you even twitch toward the trigger, we will drop you where you stand." For a man who had spent the last decade and a half terrorizing the citizens of Oak Creek, Officer Thomas Higgins broke with embarrassing speed. The heavy, suffocating silence of the parking lot was broken only by the sharp, metallic clatter of Higgins' Block 19 hitting the sun-baked asphalt. His hands, which just moments ago had brutally twisted David Miller's arms, shot into the air, trembling so violently that his fingers blurred. "Deadwitch, on your knees. Interlace your fingers behind your head. Do it now," barked Special Agent Dawson, closing the distance with his weapon still locked onto Higgins's center mass. Higgins dropped to his knees, the rough concrete tearing at his uniform pants. The swagger, the arrogance, the untouchable aura of the corrupt cop evaporated into the humid Illinois air. 2 federal tactical agents flanked him instantly. One grabbed his interlaced fingers, pinning them to the back of his skull, while the other kicked his legs apart, forcing him into a prone, completely submissive position on the ground. "But you don't understand," Higgins stammered, his voice cracking, pitching up into a pathetic, reedy whine. "Joe, this is a misunderstanding. I'm a police officer. I was conducting a routine traffic stop. This guy is a suspect." Agent Dawson didn't even dignify the lie with a response. He holstered his sidearm and walked past the blubbering officer, making a beeline straight for David. Dawson pulled a universal handcuff key from his vest, stepped behind David, and smoothly unlocked the cold steel binding his wrists. "You did perfectly, David," Dawson said quietly, his tone shifting from tactical command to deep respect. "Take a breath. You're safe. Go to your kids." David rubbed his raw, bruised wrists, the blood rushing back into his hands with a painful, prickling sensation. But he didn't care about the pain. He sprinted the 5 steps back to his Suburban, wrenching the back doors open. Leo and Chloe practically fell out of their seats and into his arms. Chloe buried her tear-streaked face into his neck, sobbing uncontrollably, while Leo wrapped his arms around his father's waist in a death grip. "I've got you. I've got you," David whispered fiercely, kissing the tops of their heads, his own eyes welling with tears. "Daddy is right here. It's over. The bad man is going away for a very long time." Hi David held his world together. Dawson walks back over to Higgins. The disgraced officer was currently being hauled to his feet by the tactical team. His wrists were secure behind his back in heavy federal-issue zip ties. The irony was palpable. The man who loved to slap cuffs on innocent people was now bound tightly, completely stripped of his power. Special Agent Richard Dawson, FBI Public Corruption Unit, Dawson introduced himself, stepping inches from Higgins' pale, sweating face. Thomas Higgins, you are under arrest for extortion under the color of official right, deprivation of civil rights, wire fraud, and making terroristic threats against a minor. You have the right to remain silent. Given what I just listened to on the wire, I highly suggest you finally use it. Dawson, please, Higgins begged, the tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. It was a sickening display. It was just talk. It was a shakedown tactic, just to scare him. I would never hurt his kids. I have a pension. I have 20 years on the force. Professional courtesy, please. You're ruining my life over one mistake. Ha ha ha! Dawson let out a cold, humorless laugh. One mistake? You really think we set up a joint task force sting operation, deployed an undercover wire, and rolled out a SWAT element for a first-time offense? Higgins' eyes widened in sheer panic. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This isn't about just today, Thomas, Dawson explained softly, stepping closer so only Higgins could hear. Operation Broken Shield has been active for 11 months. We've been watching you since November. We know about the cash drops at the marina. We know about the shell company you set up in Delaware, Apex Holdings LLC, to launder your extortion money. We have the bank records. We have the tax evasion. And best of all, we have 3 other local contractors who finally found the courage to testify against you after David stepped up to the plate. Paul, Higgins' knees buckled, but the tactical agents held him upright. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His breathing became shallow, rapid, bordering on hyperventilation. As we speak, Dawson continued, checking his tactical watch. A secondary federal team is executing a no-knock search warrant at your 5-bedroom house on Willow Creek Drive. They are ripping up your floorboards to find the safe you thought was so cleverly hidden in your basement. Your wife is currently being interviewed by IRS criminal investigators regarding her signature on those fraudulent tax returns. You didn't just ruin your life, Higgins. You burned your entire kingdom to the ground because you got greedy. No. Higgins wept openly now, a blubbering, snot-nosed mess, completely broken in front of the man he had tried to humiliate. Please, my family. My house. You should have thought about your family before you threatened to call Child Protective Services on a man's innocent children, Dawson said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. Get this piece of garbage out of my sight. The agents aggressively shoved Higgins forward, frog-marching him toward the back of the unmarked utility van. As he was pushed past the Suburban, Higgins locked eyes with David. The arrogant predator was gone. In his place was a terrified, ruined man who knew he was about to lose everything he had stolen, everything he had built, and every shred of freedom he possessed. David didn't say a word. He didn't gloat. He simply stood tall, holding his children's hands, and watched the heavy steel doors of the FBI van slam shut, locking Thomas Higgins in the darkness he deserved. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. For Thomas Higgins, the descent from a feared local kingpin to a disgraced federal inmate was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The story exploded across the local and national news. The dashcam footage from Higgins' own cruiser, combined with the crystal-clear FBI wire audio, was leaked to the press. The public was outraged. The sound of little Chloe crying in the background as a sworn officer of the law threatened to tear her away from her father became the defining audio clip of the year. Oak Creek Police Department faced a massive structural overhaul. The chief of police resigned in disgrace after an internal audit revealed he had turned a blind eye to Higgins' unorthodox methods for years. The precinct was placed under a federal consent decree, sweeping out the rot that had allowed a man like Higgins to operate with impunity. 14 months after the sweltering afternoon in the parking lot, David Miller found himself walking into the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse in downtown Chicago. He wore a sharp-tailored navy suit. He held his head high. Today was sentencing day. Inside courtroom 14B, the atmosphere was heavy and solemn. Honorable Judge William H. Prescott, a man known for his zero-tolerance policy regarding public corruption, sat behind the elevated mahogany bench, his face a mask of stern, uncompromising authority. Sitting at the defense table, wearing a wrinkled, oversized orange prison jumpsuit, was Thomas Higgins. The transformation was shocking. Stripped of his badge, his gun, and his power, Higgins looked 15 years older. His hair had thinned and gone stark white. His posture was slumped, his shoulders rounded in defeat. He had spent the last year in solitary confinement at the Metropolitan Correctional Center for his own safety. Former cops do not fare well in general population. Lead federal prosecutor Caroline Bennett had presented a flawless, devastating case. Faced with mountains of irrefutable evidence, Higgins' high-priced defense attorney had practically begged for a plea deal, but the Department of Justice refused. They wanted to make an example out of him. Higgins was forced to plead guilty to all 17 federal counts, including racketeering, extortion, civil rights abuses, and tax evasion. The court recognizes the primary victim, Mr. David Miller, for an impact statement, Judge Prescott announced, his deep voice echoing through the silent room. David stood from the front pew, buttoned his jacket, and walked purposefully to the podium. He didn't look at the judge immediately. He turned his head and looked directly at Thomas Higgins. Higgins couldn't meet his gaze. The disgraced cop kept his eyes glued to the scuffed wooden table in front of him. 14 months ago, David began, his voice clear, steady, and echoing with unshakable resolve, this man pulled me over in broad daylight. He did not pull me over because I broke a law. He pulled me over because I refused to be a victim. I refused to pay a bribe to a man who took an oath to protect my community. David paused, letting the weight of the words settle. But the extortion of my business was not his greatest crime. His greatest crime was weaponizing his badge against my family. He slapped handcuffs on me so tight they drew blood, simply to show my 9-year-old son and 6-year-old daughter that he had the power to break their father. He threatened to plant narcotics in my car. He threatened to call the state and have my children placed in foster care, all for $50,000. Higgins flinched physically at the mention of the money, burying his face in his hands. I am not a vengeful man, David continued, turning to address Judge Prescott. But a badge is a symbol of public trust. When a man like Thomas Higgins wears it, he doesn't just betray the public, he betrays every honest, hard-working police officer who puts their life on the line for the right reasons. He operated like a cartel boss in a police uniform. He deserves no leniency, Your Honor, because he offered none to the people he terrorized. David walked back to his seat. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Prescott adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the broken man at the defense table. Mr. Higgins, stand up, Judge Prescott commanded. Higgins stood, his legs trembling, flanked by 2 massive U.S. Marshals. In my 30 years on the federal bench, I have presided over cases involving violent gangs, international drug smugglers, and white-collar sociopaths, Judge Prescott said, his voice dripping with profound disgust. But the crimes committed by those individuals almost pale in comparison to yours. You were given the ultimate authority by the state, the right to use force, the right to detain, the right to enforce the law. You took that sacred trust and twisted it into a tool for your own pathetic, greedy self-enrichment. Judge Prescott picked up a thick stack of papers. You preyed on minorities. You preyed on small business owners. And when a good man finally stood up to you, you threatened his children. There is a special place in the justice system for men like you." The judge raised his gavel. "Thomas Richard Higgins, on the charges of racketeering, extortion, civil rights violations, and wire fraud, it is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to be imprisoned for a term of 288 months. 24 years. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Higgins collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut, weeping loudly into his hands. 24 years meant he would not see the outside of a prison wall until he was well into his 70s. Furthermore, as part of the RICO forfeiture, the judge ordered the immediate seizure of Higgins' pension, his home, and all assets in his bank accounts to pay restitution to his victims. His wife had already filed for divorce. His friends on the force had abandoned him. He was leaving this courtroom with absolutely nothing. Hard karma had not just knocked on his door, it had kicked it off the hinges. "Take him away," Judge Prescott ordered. The marshals hauled the sobbing former officer to his feet, shackled his wrists to a belly chain, and led him out the side door of the courtroom. As the door clicked shut behind him, the nightmare officially ended. David walked out of the federal courthouse into the bright, crisp Chicago afternoon. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a picture message from his wife. It was a photo of Leo and Chloe sitting at the kitchen table, their faces covered in chocolate ice cream sprinkles, smiling from ear to ear. David smiled, took a deep breath of the free air, and walked down the marble steps. The system was broken in many places, but today it had worked. A predator had been removed from the streets, and a father had shown his children that bullies, no matter what uniform they wear, can always be beaten when good people refuse to back down. If this story of absolute justice and hard-hitting karma hit home for you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to see the good guys win. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our true-to-life stories of dramatic takedowns and real-world justice. Drop a comment below. How would you have handled the situation in David's shoes? Stay safe and see you next time.